And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. John Sack, who's our next speaker. John was one of the founders, if not the founder, of HighWire Press, which started in 1995 as a department of Stanford University, where John was previously responsible for IT. He's going to look at the conundrum that despite nearly 15 years of digitization, apart from being online, much of scholarly communication is unchanged. John.
Well, thank you. Like previous speakers, I'm going to do some dynamic editing of my slides, having a bit less time than I had anticipated, but you're going to see the slides. They're just going to go by faster. I'll talk fast. So I'm going to primarily address three topics. The first is to talk about workflow in general. What is it about? The second is where I'll spend most of the time describing these things that I call points of friction in the workflow. And then third, I'd like to conclude by pointing a bit into the future. And I think here you'll see that I've got clear points of alignment with the two previous speakers. So first, what's workflow? I'm going to talk very generically about it. It's a way of getting things done. It's a series of steps, a repeatable pattern. You can look this up in the net. If you Google it, in fact, you find these are the primary answers, but you also find this next one, that workflow is a BS management word for a process we don't understand. And that may be true. And the concept is that it's a very organized kind of thing. And I think this is one of the problems in our understanding of workflow. It suggests a model that's linear, that moves all in one direction. And this really may not be suitable anymore as a metaphor for the communication processes that we're now using in science. Essentially, as science becomes more like Web 2.0, it always has been. It's just the publishing model hasn't really been consistent with a communication model. It may be that it really will not look like what's on the left, which is how we organize it for publishing purposes, but more like what's on the right. I'm going to be primarily talking about excuse me, the workflow about researchers. This is where friction wastes time, causes people to lose focus, it slows progress, it costs more money. Of course, publishers have workflows too. I'm really not going to be talking about publishers' workflows, and there's certainly a whole conference could be devoted to where's the friction in the publisher side of the workflow. And as a platform supplier, certainly I'm very interested in that. Now, workflows, we've studied workflows at HighWire, studied them formally starting in 2002, and actually had a grant to come up with what is the workflow before it started changing significantly when journals were put online. 2002 was a period when the assumptions were changing about whether everything would be online. Right around then, it was becoming clear that all journals were going to be online, and it was just a matter of time. Then about 10 years later, we did another study to look at workflows, and what we found is essentially nothing had changed. The workflow seemed to be consistent. What had changed is that we were no longer calling things e-journals. We dropped the E in e-journals because everybody just assumed, well, that is the journal, is the online journal. Now, I actually think that the fact that the workflow did not appear to change is a problem. My thesis is that without a real change in the workflow and how we implement it and support it in our journal systems, the friction builds up, pressure builds up at the places where these tectonic plates rub against each other. So I think these friction points are important ones for us to look at because we probably do need to make some movement on some of them. Now, In fact, the 2012 workflow was already evolving into something I've drawn here. This is you looking at my very limited graphic skills, that the workflow by 2010 or so was already changing so that instead of having this idealized model of a circle with a single user at the center, you really ended up with a network of people communicating throughout the publishing process, the scholarly communication process. It's not that people weren't connected before the 21st century, but they're now very continuously connected so that during the workflow, people are moving information back and forth. So what is this friction and why is it bad? Well, I'd say that friction is a distraction from the task at hand. It's a change in course. It's a time when something has to move that isn't really very well facilitated by our systems. It's a pause. It's a time where it's some time where there's a gap in time that's taken that isn't actually moving science forward. And not all friction is bad. Some of it is intentional. I'd say peer review is an example of a type of friction. It's an intentional pause in the process where essentially things are being evaluated, and so the science stops moving forward. I think that actually is part of the friction. In Stewart's conference in the spring of 2015 that he just described, quite a lot of time was spent talking about the friction in peer review. Now, peer review is probably one of the most obvious ones. I think you can see other types of friction pretty easily. I call them telltales. You can find where friction points are occurring. Pricing, for example, can cause friction. We just had virtual reality is certainly, at least in my part of the U.S., in Silicon Valley, pretty clearly is coming along. But it was interesting to see that Google Cardboard was introduced at a price point of about $15. That's assuming you don't actually just make it yourself out of your own cardboard, whereas Oculus Rift is now priced at $500. And I think that's essentially going to, that friction point in the difference in pricing has actually caused the innovation that drove the development of Google Cardboard, essentially an everyman's virtual reality, which I think will be important in publishing as virtual reality starts getting incorporated into exploration and explanation, which is, of course, what a lot of communication is about. There are other kinds of telltales. Generational shifts can cause friction where it didn't appear to be friction before. One generation thought the selection at Tower Records was an amazing selection, all of these CDs that you could buy. Well, a later generation didn't think that was the best way to do it. It wasn't good for convenience. It wasn't good also for price. So I think this, in a way, opened the opportunity. This kind of friction of Tower Records opened the opportunity for Apple and others in the music industry to develop a new type of service. Perhaps you've seen this diagram before. This is a fascinating depiction of 400 different tools that are available in the scholarly publishing workflow. Notice this also uses that same wagon wheel metaphor that I used in previous diagrams. This is showing all sorts of little products, actually little and big products. You can see some of the logos. You probably recognize, the Mendeley logo and so on. Products that have developed in response, I'd say, to friction in the workflow. These are products that help people move something from one part of the workflow to another. These tools have essentially sprung up in response to friction in the scholarly workflow, and they're enabled in particular by key standards in our industry, such as DOIs, and I think particularly ORCID identification. I'm going to quickly look at just a few of the friction points that I'd like to call out. I have about a dozen or so slides here. I'm going to skip over a couple of them. I've organized this list more or less in the same order as this wagon wheel. So the first one that I'd like to tackle is manuscript submissions. And there's a very clear experience that authors have in submission that it is burdensome. For each journal you end up submitting to, and often you submit to at least two in the review process, sometimes more. You have to prepare separate submissions with separate rules, formats, files, and so on. There's an interesting, Joe Esposito wrote in the Scholarly Kitchen last year that basically everybody hates their manuscript submission system. So the question is, what could you do about it? Well, I think the heavy lift, as we call it in Silicon Valley, would be essentially to develop an Uber system that you would submit to, that would then, on your behalf, submit to journals. This is the kind of thing that's common in the States in college submissions now. It's called the Common Application. It's been done in that area, and perhaps it could be done in scholarly publishing. But a much simpler, probably 80% solution is something called format-neutral submissions. And this is something that the Genetics Society of America pioneered. I don't know whether others had done it previously. It's certainly a partial solution to the irritation, but it is one of the simplest solutions to a good part of the problem. Essentially, what genetics says is, send us whatever you've got. If we decide that we're interested in publishing it, then we'll send you the rule book, and then you have to go through the formal submission process. And as you can see, researchers love this idea, and it was not a radical thing to implement for the journal. I've since seen at least one other journal in infectious disease, I believe, pick up the same idea. But as Stuart pointed out, there's more friction in peer review than just in submission. The whole of peer review is of course, under scrutiny. There's a lot of room for improvement in this. And one of the interesting things is how much seems to be going on in experimentation now. In this, Stuart listed several of the things that the Royal Society itself is doing. But in addition, I've seen eLife has done a number of things to improve the peer review process, getting a single message from an editor to the submitting author rather than getting conflicting reports from reviewers, a collaborative process, open review, an objective review, as Stuart mentioned, and then, of course, having the reviews themselves published. Another friction point I'd highlight is essentially peer review as a barrier to dissemination, and that the experts in a field want to see the papers earlier. They are able to make their own determination of what's quality, and what they need is the timeliness. So the idea, and this is quite well discussed in the Royal Society meeting, is to flip distribution and review essentially through preprint servers. The idea by the scientists in the room was readily accepted that this is a positive. And yes, there are problems with it, but those can be addressed. So I think we're going to definitely see preprint servers moving forward. Not just archive, which is of course widely known, but things like bioRxiv from Cold Spring Harbor Labs is clearly successful. I think there are a couple of other topics. The fact that complex media objects are difficult to incorporate in our publishing systems is a friction point. These are active media objects as opposed to GIFs and TIFFs. Barend talked about supplementary information, just say no. I think this sort of shows what the problem is that you get data sets that are PDFs, you get 10 different objects all stuck onto, just tacked onto the narrative. One that I'd like to highlight, a friction point, is what I'll call the gray literature, and this is that authors are creating many public objects that make their research more accessible to a research audience, but not necessarily the expert who is the primary target of a paper. This can be blog posts, podcasts, tweets, journal clubs, departmental web pages, meeting presentations primarily. And all of these are unlinked from the research article themselves. They often are linked to the research article, but the research article is not a hub, much as publishers like to think of it as a hub. It's really just one of the places where the story is being told. And I think this is a huge opportunity that we're missing now. Collaboration through annotation right now is not very well supported. It's supported through proprietary tools primarily. I think there's a possibility that with Hypothesis just breaking into the market, we'll have some movement in open tools. The question here is that reading is hard work. If you can quickly pick out the key messages in this piece of text, you're better than I am and better than almost every expert who looks at it. And that's the problem. People have a lot to sift through, and we don't make it very easy for them to do that. Keeping up is difficult. Alerting systems are popular, but they're not particularly well integrated. The question is, are we going to see a shift, perhaps a generational shift, from a just-in-case kind of mentality, which is certainly what I grew up with, that is, you had to keep up with your field, to a just-in-time model where, no, I don't try to keep up. It's just when I'm done each research project, I'll dive in and get caught up, essentially as the need arises. Let me skip this one. This is pretty clear, I think, to all of us. We see a problem. We've heard from researchers about the problem in journal websites. I call it the distracted driving problem, the Swiss Army knife problem. There's so much going on the web pages that we publish that it's very hard for people to find the thing they want, which is usually the link to the PDF. Some treatments of that have been kind of interesting. This is an example from a product we worked on with eLife called Lens, which presents a two-up version of an article with the narrative on one side and essentially the data on the other. And some people prefer to read the data and then look into the context, and this supports that. Essentially, we heard from users, we asked for feedback on this particular Lens view, and we got a piece of interesting feedback is that this is great. You're reversing the trend of brand-heavy web designs, essentially making every journal site look like the Huffington Post, and it's about time for that to stop. One of the problems that I think is we really should be dealing with, I don't have a good idea about how, is something I'll call subarticle referencing and linking. I should be able to cite and link to a section or paragraph in an article, not just to the top of the article. We reference pages in books. We reference specific sections in legal texts. So why is it that in the journal article literature, we only point to the top of an article? And God help you if it's a 50-page review article that you've just had to look through. Book chapter indexing is so far behind discovery of journal literature. Essentially, when you are looking for summed up knowledge, which is often well represented in the book literature, the only thing you can retrieve is a book, and then you have to find your way to the relevant chapter. Scholarly image indexing is another friction point. You might think you could retrieve figures, especially if you asked very specifically. This is a pretty specific request I asked Google. I said, show me images for the structural basis for the lack of et cetera, and what I got was a bunch of heads. It actually turns out that that is the figure that I was looking for. So it's there, but quite a lot of excess there. Off-campus resource access is a serious issue. If you don't work in the academy yourself, you might not realize how hard this is. Readers frequently do literature work off-campus, outside of the bounds of institutional subscriptions that are campus-based. And yes, there are proxy servers. It is a tedious, multi-step process to gain access to those. And it's not just one that you do. You have to do it in several cases. You'll have to do it for every journal that you want to access. And it might be different for different journals because publishers have done this differently for different journals. So what happens? Well, you take the friction-free approach. You go to Google Scholar, you say, show me the open access version of this article. That's what I'll read. So we're leaving a lot of usage essentially untapped. Just to wrap up, I want to take a look at the workflow in the future. And here I think we'll see that comments from the two previous speakers really align pretty well with what I see coming. 20 years ago, what did the future of video look like? The future of music, the future of retailing, even the future of making telephone calls. All those are things that have completely changed in the last 20 years. And I think that people, we have to remember that scientists are themselves consumers in their real life, and that they're going to have expectations of how they use the literature, how it works for them, that are conditioned by what they're seeing in the consumer world that they inhabit, the expectations of the technology. It's easy to see straight ahead. Usually we do this, we plan for continuity, we plan for things to get bigger or for them to get faster. If we had done that, of course, we would have predicted bigger fins on the 1960 cars from the 1950s. And these are, well, the top is an actual picture of a 1950 car and the 1960 concept car below, which I don't think I ever saw in production. So we have to find ways to predict, to see around the corner, essentially, for the discontinuities, where you're probably aware of Moore's law that says basically every 18 months things double. And so what that means is over about 20, 22 years, that leads to a 1,000-fold increase in performance, whether it be in storage, whether it be in compute speed. So if you try to imagine your cell phone being 1,000 times more powerful in 20 years than it is today, what would you be doing with it? Well, you wouldn't be making telephone calls with it. So those are the kind of discontinuities that we can understand already through lots of background in how computing works. I think Baron sort of gave us a good sense about what we're going to do with all of that computing power. But there are also kinds of discontinuities that happen through, say, a country making a change in its policy around publishing, around science. If NIH decided that all APCs could only be paid for pure open access journals, that might change what some publishers do pretty significantly. I think, to me, a key thing is that today's metaphor is that the internet is a library, and we sort of use it as a library, the information retrieval model, I'd call it, which assumes that what scholars want to do is to find articles, read articles, and write articles. And I think that is very much focused around the wagon wheel that you've seen in a couple of my slides, the concept that the narrative is what we're all about producing, as opposed to communication and knowledge. And I think the model is now shifting to an action model, and I think Baron again showed us what some of that action might be, which is that the computers will be reading the data and essentially creating actions, creating answers to communicate to humans. So well beyond the information retrieval model that we'll be going. I think we'll be moving from a publishing push model, essentially, that says someone sends you a text and you push it out to many, many people, to supporting conversation, a full interaction around knowledge. And the question is, do we as publishers want to support the full interaction around the knowledge? Do we as publishers want to support that, or do we want that happening somewhere else? I think it's interesting how Stuart described the meeting that the Royal Society held. It was about, as he said, how scientists might communicate in the future. It was not about how scientists might publish in the future. So if we want to shift and support communication, I think that has to move us beyond today's conventions. And I think a serious part of this is the machine learning. Again, this is what Baron has spent much of his talk about, is that the machines will be reading, I say the literature, I think he was saying the data, which is a very good point, and then acting on it to contextualize it, personalize it, and perhaps even remanufacture it. I would describe this as the scholarly communication equivalent of precision medicine. Right now, we work very much in a model where authors do a study and produce a paper which everybody reads, that paper. We're very much focused on what we call the version of record, as if there has to be only one version of an article. Well, that's sort of the way we treat disease now. But personalized medicine is leading us to a completely different view of how you treat disease. That is, you connect up the specific mutations with the knowledge of what an individual needs and has in their body, and so you essentially personalize the medicine, personalized to their genetic signature. And I think that we could imagine in 20 years, maybe a lot less, that the machines will essentially produce for you. They'll manufacture the article that you need in your research based on their reading of the literature. Now, that's a lot of hype. I should always warn about hype. We're in now what some journalists have called the awkward years of virtual reality, underwhelming, artificial intelligence that feels annoyingly unintelligent, etc. And I think it is important to know that when people like me talk about things like this, we sometimes overstate something that seems to be a short-term potential, but the long-term consequences of what's going on here, I think, are enormous for the roles of publishers. And I think, consistent with the two previous speakers, I don't think we could overstate the long term in this case. Thank you.
Thank you, John. We've got time for one very quick question, if there is one.
Good morning. I'm Chris Armbruster, and I often do the rapporteuring for this conference. I have a question. You've sort of outlined the frictions, and you're the founder of HighWire Press. So if you were to found something today, which field would you go for? Which friction would seem most promising to you to tackle?
Ooh. My wish list. I think there's a huge payoff in two places. At the two opposite ends of the workflow, if you imagine a linear workflow, I think there's huge payoff in changing what we do in peer review to make it possible for people to know about discovery, that experts to know about discovery well in advance. I think that's a place where I would probably work. And at the other end is just where Barend was pointing, that is applying machine intelligence to read these documents and to present something much more customized, personalized to me as a researcher. The model we have now is helping us organize the literature, but it's very much an information retrieval model, and I think that's so 1960s. It's amazing it's continuing this long. I think it's in part because it does work. It's not completely broken, but it's aging fast. Honestly, I find it hard to imagine that in 20 years, when I'm in my autonomously navigating vehicle, I will still want to be searching the literature the same way I do now. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, John.